Before we get started, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our future explorations. All right, Congress is back, and let's just say things are already getting interesting with some pretty intense discussions going on.
Definitely off to a lively start.
Today, we're taking a look at the congressional record from January 16th.
Lots to cover.
Yeah. From disaster relief in California to a really controversial cabinet nomination for Health and Human Services. And who knew a tiny fish called the snail darter could almost stop an entire environmental act?
It's amazing how these seemingly unrelated topics actually tap into these big questions facing the U.S. right now, like how do we handle climate change, what does immigration reform look like, and what is the role of government in times of crisis?
It's a lot. Let's start with this bill that's causing a lot of debate, the Preventing Violence Against Women by Illegal Aliens Act.
H.R. 30.
H.R. 30. This one seems to be a major point of contention.
Yeah, it's a really clear example of how divided Congress is on the whole issue of immigration. This bill basically expands the reasons why someone can be denied entry to the U.S. or deported, specifically looking at sex offenses and domestic violence committed by undocumented immigrants.
Right. Representatives like Mrs. Lee of Florida and Mr. Harris of North Carolina strongly support this bill.
Right. They argue it's crucial for protecting American communities. They even cited a really disturbing case involving Eduardo Sarabia, who was arrested for running what they called a rape dungeon on wheels.
But then you have representatives like Mr. Raskin and Ms. McCollum who argue that this bill is totally unnecessary and could actually be harmful.
They say existing laws already address these crimes, and this new bill could discourage immigrant survivors of abuse from reporting anything.
And they bring up the case of a student visa holder who was arrested after defending herself from her boyfriend when he tried to rape her. She bit him in self-defense, but she ended up being convicted of domestic violence. And under H.R. 30, she could be deported just for admitting to those facts, even without a conviction.
It's a really complicated situation. How do we make sure that the laws that are supposed to protect vulnerable people don't actually end up hurting them?
Yeah, and how do we balance protecting victims with making sure justice is served, especially when immigration status is part of the equation?
Definitely something to think about.
So the roll call vote on H.R. 30 was 274 yeas to 145 nays.
A pretty clear partisan divide.
Yeah, most Republicans voting yes and most Democrats voting no. But it was more than just the numbers. The language used in this debate was really intense.
Absolutely. Representatives on both sides were using really emotionally charged language. They were invoking victims, painting these really vivid pictures of what could happen. It's a reminder that we're not just talking about abstract policies here. There are real people's lives and safety at stake.
Absolutely. And speaking of real people's lives, the wildfires in Southern California were another big topic.
It's just devastating. Over 12,000 structures destroyed, 40,000 acres burned. Tragic stories of loss, but also incredible stories of heroism are coming out of this disaster.
Representative Tlaib spoke about her heartbreak for the people who lost everything, and Representative Carbajal questioned why aid for California would even be up for debate. He asked, "Are these families not American?"
A valid question, especially when you consider that billions of dollars were allocated for hurricane relief in other states without this kind of debate.
But some California representatives like Mr. LaMalfa took a different stance. He really emphasized personal accountability, arguing that California's mismanagement of resources like forests and water actually made these fires worse.
A controversial viewpoint, but it does raise important questions about the connection between environmental policies, preparing for disasters, and holding the government accountable for its actions. It forces us to ask, how do we effectively address this growing threat of wildfires, not just in California, but across the entire West?
President Biden did sign an executive order to deal with this wildfire disaster. But Mr. LaMalfa brought up another point that directly relates to the fires, how California manages its water.
He argued that California's decisions about water resources, like when to release water from reservoirs and how that water is allocated, are making the wildfire problem even worse.
He actually used a visual aid during his speech to show how much water is flowing into the Pacific Ocean that could be used to replenish reservoirs like the Santo Ynez, which is practically empty right now. He's saying that this water is a critical resource for fighting fires, especially with climate change making everything hotter and drier.
Water management in California, and really throughout the West, is a complex issue. It's all about finding that delicate balance between the needs of farmers, cities, and the environment, especially while facing droughts and a changing climate.
He highlighted how important California's agricultural output is for the whole country. If they can't get the water they need, food prices could go up, and we might end up having to rely on imports from other countries.
This really ties into the bigger picture of food security and national resilience. Are we doing enough to make sure that our food supply can withstand these challenges of a changing climate?
And to illustrate his point about regulations, Mr. Lamalfa brought up a pretty unlikely character, the snail darter.
This tiny fish almost single-handedly stopped a major dam project. It's a perfect example of how even the smallest details can have huge consequences.
Back in the 1970s, they were building the Tellico Dam in Tennessee, and construction was halted because this little fish, the snail darter, which was only found in that river, was declared endangered under the new Endangered Species Act.
It caused a major debate about balancing economic development with protecting the environment. Some people argued that the Endangered Species Act was being used to just obstruct progress.
The case even went to the Supreme Court.
And the court ruled in favor of the snail darter and the Endangered Species Act.
But here's the thing. Later research showed that the snail darter wasn't actually a unique species at all. It was just a variation of another, more common type of darter fish.
This raises some really interesting questions about how we identify species and whether environmental groups might sometimes use regulations to push their own agendas, even if it means important projects get delayed without good reason.
Looking at the bigger picture, it shows how important it is to think carefully about environmental regulations and maybe even reform them. How do we protect biodiversity while making sure regulations are based on solid science and don't just unnecessarily hold back economic development?
It's a tough balancing act.
Yeah, and this whole debate about finding that balance came up again with President Biden's cabinet nominations. Some of these nominations have been very controversial.
They really highlight the deep partisan divide in Washington.
For example, RFK Jr.'s nomination for Secretary of Health and Human Services. That's gotten a lot of pushback. Senator Warren even warned that his stance on vaccines could really hurt public health.
Her concerns about misinformation and people losing trust in vaccines are really important, especially with all the challenges we've seen with vaccine hesitancy.
And then there's Pete Hegseth, nominated for Secretary of Defense. His lack of experience and some of his past statements about women in the military have been criticized by both Democrats and Republicans.
Senator Warren and others have questioned his qualifications and temperament, saying he doesn't have the experience or judgment to lead the Department of Defense.
And all of this is happening in a very tense political climate. A new president, a divided Congress. There's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen next.
These nominations really show just how high the stakes are and the potential consequences of ideological extremes. Can we find common ground on crucial issues like public health and national security when things are so polarized?
Yeah, it really raises the question, can we have productive debates and actually find solutions? Or are we just stuck in this endless cycle of partisan gridlock?
It does make you wonder, and some representatives like Mrs. Lee from Florida went as far as to say that the Democrats who voted against H.R. 30 basically have the blood of victims on their hands.
That kind of rhetoric is really concerning.
Yeah. It just escalates the political discourse, creating this climate of fear and division, and that makes finding common ground almost impossible.
Right. It's like they're not even trying to have a conversation. They're just trying to score points.
Exactly. And it reminds us that we as citizens need to hold our elected officials accountable for what they say and do. We should expect civil discourse and reject these attempts to demonize people who have different views.
For sure. But amidst all this controversy, there were some moments of bipartisanship, especially when it came to the topic of disaster relief for California.
Senator Schiff and Feinstein, both from California, made these really compelling speeches about the need for unity and support. They urged their colleagues to put aside their differences and help those in need.
And they talked about how Californians from all walks of life were helping each other. Firefighters risking their lives, businesses donating supplies, regular people opening their homes to those who had been displaced.
Those stories of resilience and compassion are really inspiring.
Yeah, it reminds you that even in the midst of tragedy, there's still hope and humanity.
Absolutely.
And the senators emphasized that California has a long road ahead when it comes to rebuilding and recovering from these fires.
They stress that they're going to need continued support from the federal government, not just for the immediate relief efforts, but also for the long-term process of rebuilding infrastructure, restoring these communities, and addressing those underlying causes of these fires.
Right, because this isn't just about putting out the fires and cleaning up. This is about making sure it doesn't happen again.
Exactly. And beyond this immediate crisis, there were also discussions about how we can better prepare for future disasters, especially as the threat of climate change continues to grow.
Representative Benz from Oregon, who has actually dealt with wildfires in his own state, spoke about the need to adapt and improve our strategies for preventing and managing these wildfires. He brought up a really interesting point about how we allocate resources.
He argued that all the money we spend trying to mitigate climate change might not be available when we need it to adapt to the effects that are already happening.
So he's basically saying we need to be realistic about this.
Yeah, he's acknowledging that climate change is happening, and we need to invest in strategies that protect our communities from these risks, like wildfires, droughts, extreme weather.
Right, we can't just focus on preventing climate change. We also need to figure out how to live with it.
Exactly. And to illustrate his point, he used a really powerful visual aid. He showed two photos, one of a healthy forest and one of a dense, overgrown forest.
Okay.
And he explained that this unmanaged forest is way more likely to experience wildfires. The trees are too close together, they're competing for resources. It's basically a tinderbox just waiting to ignite.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
And then he compared that to the situation in California, arguing that years of neglecting forest management combined with these drought conditions have created the perfect conditions for these megafires.
So it's not just about climate change, it's also about how we manage our forests.
Right, it's a combination of factors. And he also pointed out that environmental regulations, although they have good intentions, can sometimes have unintended consequences.
Like making it harder to manage forests effectively.
Exactly. He even brought up the snail darter example again, suggesting that sometimes the focus on protecting one particular species can actually get in the way of efforts to reduce these bigger environmental risks.
That's really interesting. It's like a balancing act, isn't it?
It is. How do we balance the need to protect biodiversity with the need to protect communities from these increasingly destructive wildfires?
Right, because both are important.
Absolutely. And it's a question that lawmakers, scientists, and communities all across the West are trying to figure out. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
So what do we do?
Well, we need to start having honest conversations about the trade-offs and work together to find these creative and sustainable solutions.
We have to find a way to protect both the environment and the people who live in it.
Exactly. And on the topic of innovation, there was some really exciting news out of the space exploration world. Representative Kylie from California talked about the successful first flight of Blue Origin's new Glenn rocket.
Oh yeah, I heard about that.
This is a huge step for the commercial space industry. It shows how private companies are becoming major players in space exploration and scientific discovery.
It's amazing how much progress they've made. This rocket is taller than the Statue of Liberty, and it can carry a massive payload into orbit.
It's really a testament to American ingenuity and the power of private enterprise to push the limits of what's possible.
Yeah, it's pretty inspiring. And Representative Kiley also talked about his new Space Age Act. This bill is all about making it easier to get launch approvals and encouraging the growth of the commercial space industry.
It shows how important the space industry is becoming, not just for scientific advancement, but also for economic growth and national security.
It's like a whole new frontier opening up.
It is, and it creates new opportunities and new challenges. We need to figure out how to regulate and support this rapidly evolving industry.
It makes you wonder what the future holds for space exploration. What are we going to discover next?
And speaking of the future, another topic that kept coming up was the national debt and the looming fight over raising the debt ceiling.
Yeah, that's been a concern for a while now.
It has, and it seems like it's finally coming to a head. Senator Lee from Utah gave a pretty sobering presentation. He broke down the numbers and outlined the potential consequences of our growing national debt.
And the numbers are pretty scary. We're spending almost $7 trillion a year.
It's a staggering amount, and Senator Lee argued that this level of spending is unsustainable. It's putting our economic future at risk, and it's creating a huge burden for future generations.
He even suggested going back to the spending levels we had under presidents like Bill Clinton or Barack Obama.
It's a controversial idea, but it shows how worried people are about the long-term effects of our current spending habits.
It seems like this debate is only going to get more intense as we go forward.
Definitely. Especially with a divided Congress and a president who has promised to be fiscally responsible, the fight over the debt ceiling is going to be a major political battle.
It'll be interesting to see how both sides handle this and if they're even willing to compromise.
It's a real test of our political system's ability to deal with these complicated and divisive issues. And the outcome will have a huge impact on our economy and our place in the world.
It's a big deal. But even with all this political tension and fighting, there were some really nice moments of recognizing and honoring individuals who have made a difference.
Several representatives and senators took time to pay tribute to people who have dedicated their lives to serving their communities and the country.
One tribute that really stood out to me was from Senator Sullivan. He honored his staffer, Kathleen Rawle, who was leaving, to pursue another opportunity after years of dedicated service to his office and the people of Alaska.
He spoke about her incredible commitment to helping constituents, her ability to deal with complex issues, and her deep love for Alaska.
He even shared a story about how she played a key role in a major natural gas deal with ExxonMobil. She went up against a team of 25 lawyers, and she won.
It was a great way to recognize the people who work behind the scenes doing the work that keeps the government running.
Yeah, those people don't always get the credit they deserve. And it shows how public service can attract talented and dedicated individuals who are committed to serving their communities and their country.
Absolutely. And speaking of people who have dedicated their lives to service, Representative Raskin from Maryland gave a really moving speech about Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy and the ongoing fight for civil rights. And his words were especially powerful because this was just a few days before we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day.
It was a really fitting tribute.
He talked about how Dr. King's dream of equality and justice is still so relevant today, and he really urged his colleagues to keep fighting for social and economic justice for everyone.
And he connected Dr. King's fight for racial equality to the current debates about immigration reform.
He argued that we need to treat all people with dignity and respect, regardless of their immigration status.
He also talked about the importance of voting rights and making sure that every citizen has access to the ballot box.
Especially relevant given all the recent attempts to restrict voting in some states.
Yeah, that's a fight that's still going on.
It is. And his speech reminded everyone that the fight for civil rights is far from over. We need to protect the progress we've made and keep pushing for more.
It's a call to action for all of us.
To be involved in the political process, to speak out against injustice, and to work towards a society that's truly just and equitable for everyone.
We can't just sit back and assume that things will get better on their own. We have to be active participants in making change happen.
Absolutely. And speaking of justice, there are also some discussions about criminal justice reform, specifically the need to address the root causes of crime and provide opportunities for rehabilitation.
So not just locking people up, but actually trying to help them turn their lives around.
Exactly. Senator Booker from New Jersey, who's been a big advocate for criminal justice reform, talked about the need to invest in communities, create jobs, and break that cycle of poverty and incarceration.
He's right. If people don't have opportunities, they're more likely to end up in the system.
He argued that our current system is way too focused on punishment, and it doesn't do enough to address the social and economic factors that lead to crime.
Like lack of education, poverty, mental health issues.
Exactly. And he talked about how mass incarceration disproportionately affects communities of color and the need to address racial disparities in the justice system.
It's not a level playing field.
It's not.
Yeah.
He called for a more humane and effective approach to criminal justice, one that emphasizes prevention, rehabilitation, and restorative justice.
It's about giving people a second chance.
It is. And it's about recognizing that everyone makes mistakes, but that doesn't mean they're beyond redemption.
So it's been a busy week in Congress. A lot of important issues being debated.
Definitely. From immigration and disaster relief to cabinet nominations, the debt ceiling, climate change, civil rights, criminal justice reform, it's a lot to keep track of.
It is, but it's also really important to stay informed and engaged.
Absolutely. The decisions that are being made in Washington right now will have a huge impact on all of our lives.
So what can we do?
We can start by staying informed about the issues. We can contact our representatives and let them know what we think. We can vote in elections, and we can get involved in our communities and support organizations that are working to make a difference.
It can feel overwhelming sometimes, but every little bit helps.
It does. And remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes all of us working together.
Well said. Thanks for joining me today for this look at the congressional record. It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking discussion.
My pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better future.